Well, welcome everyone to our PSA online forum for February. We're very excited to celebrate Black History Month with this very special session. And I have disabled the chat for now, but after all of our panelists get a chance to speak, I will enable the chat again for questions. All right, so Imran, if you'd like to start, please do.
Welcome everyone. My name is Imran Esplin. I'm a vice president in the Post Studies Association, but today I'm wearing my editor's hat as the editor of the journal Post Studies History, Theory, Interpretation. And I'm very excited to be with you this afternoon as we kick off what for us at the journal is going to be a great special feature on African American writers responding to Poe. This is a special feature that will appear in the journal a little over a year and a half from now. So it's going to be the feature of our 2023 volume. And I want to thank from the get-go Drs. Tish Crawford and John Grusier for their work on this. This has been a long time coming, and we still have a long way to go for this feature. But I'm excited for this panel, and I hope I'm still there. Did I just get kicked off?
No, you're okay.
Okay, my screen just disappeared, but I'm glad you can still hear me. Let me fix this. There, now I can see you. I think the share screen dropped off. But I'm excited for this panel, which is an introduction to the special feature that we're going to have. And I'd like to thank Michelle and Frankie for being here early on in the process, for working with Tish and John as we get this kicked off. Many of you in the Poe community know there's good work done on Poe and race, but there's a lot to be done. And we're excited to have this discussion today and eventually this special feature where we get to hear about African-American writers and scholars and their responses to the work and world of Edgar Allan Poe. So that's my spiel, and I'll turn from there the time over to John and Tish. Thank you.
Thanks, Imran. So today there are four of us. Norlisha Crawford and I are the editors of the special feature that Imran is talking about. In addition to this PSA Zoom forum, there is going to be a session at the 5th International Poe Conference in Boston. We are scheduled for Friday morning at 8:30, so get your coffee and be ready. At that time, both Michelle and Frankie will be presenting a paper which will be, connected with the essay the essays that they're doing for the special feature. So we're getting a teaser today from the two of them. So let me do some introductions. Norlisha Crawford is Associate Professor and Director of African American Studies Emerita at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh. Michelle Robinson is Associate Professor of American Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And Frankie Y. Bailey is Professor of Criminal Justice at SUNY Albany and is also a mystery writer herself. So to give you a sense of how this special feature is going to be organized, there are two parts to it. The first part is going to be 4 scholarly essays, and the second part of it is going to be 5 pieces from creative writers. You're going to hear brief versions or teasers, as I said, of 2 of the scholarly from Frankie and Michelle. Tish is going to tell you about another essay by Isaiah Lavender. I'm going to talk about a 4th essay by Shireen Sherrard Johnson. Tish is going to tell you about a hybrid piece by Gary Phillips. And then I'll talk briefly about the other creative pieces that we're going to have as part of the special feature. And then we will turn it over to Frankie. And then finally, Michelle will bring us home prior to the Q&A. So Tish, do you want to talk about Isaiah's and Gary's pieces, please?
Sure. Thank you and welcome, everybody. I want to first say that some people will refer to me as Norlisha, some as Tish, but it's just always me in both cases. And the other thing I'd like to say, in addition to thanking Frankie and Michelle for being here to give us this little taste, this little teaser. Thank you very much and hello to both of you. Then also I'd like to suggest that I am a co-editor for this project and I'm very happily involved, but actually John is the Poe person. I am the person who is supporting the project as a co-editor because I'm just so curious about what is going to be produced by these creative writers and these scholars. So really, I want to be upfront about that in case you ask me any really involved question about Poe and I really want to know the answer. Okay, as for Isaiah, Isaiah Lavender, he is the Sterling Goodman Professor of English at the University of Georgia. And he has offered to us a very interesting essay idea. And I'm going to, in the interest of time, just simply read his opening paragraph to his proposal. And it says, "Stop apologizing for Edgar Allan Poe." And it's got an exclamation point. As important a figure as he is to dark romanticism, anti-transcendentalism in American literature, to Gothic fiction, to detective fiction, to science fiction, he is racist. And he says, Isaiah says, "I repeat, stop apologizing for Poe. As a man of his time, I find him blatantly racist as revealed through his only novel, The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket. And plenty of great American writers revealed their racism through their writing, so that's not the big surprise. Henry James, H.P. Lovecraft, Ernest Hemingway, etc. But it's such a fascinating novel, particularly for its association with lost race tales, a science fictional subgenre beloved by the scientific romance writers of the 19th century, that I want to write about it. What's more, I find it doubly intriguing that it's juxtaposed to Matt Johnson's Afrofuturistic retelling of Poe's novel in Pym. So through the secondary character of Dirk Peters, whose ambiguous racial heritage in Poe's novel as Native American and something white is made over into an unambiguous colored man in Johnson's novel. "Let me be clear," says Isaiah, "this is a powerful intertextual moment. This transformation of skin color forms the crux of my argument." So as you can see, there are people who will respond to this with a different reading of what race means in both Pyms. But Isaiah has a very strong sense of what he wants to present as a thesis for us to highlight in the Poe Studies special feature. Now, I should say also that he's written about race in American science fiction and Afrofuturism rising, the literary prehistory of a movement. So he's deeply ensconced in thinking about these things from a genre point of view. Now, moving on from Isaiah to Gary. Gary Phillips is a very interesting person to have in this special feature because he is a fiction writer. But on his webpage, he describes himself as having written 18 novels, 9 comics, and 50 short stories. So what he's offering to us for the special feature is a kind of hybrid, as John described it. And that's a reimagining of the idea of Poe's work, but also as it might be rewritten in a creative way. So I would describe it as a reimagining of fiction and creative nonfiction in the story that Gary is going to present to us. It really does read like a mix, and he is in draft form with it at this point, and soon we'll start responding to what he's written. So we'll have some sense, I guess, in a way, if it's more one genre than the other by the time it comes for the special feature. In any event, I think this mix of scholars and creative writers is really going to give us, and the interviews, of course, of both, is going to give us a very important and timely special feature. And I'm happy that Poe Studies is going to offer it. Thank you.
Thanks, Tish.
You're welcome.
Let me talk about the fourth essay, the scholarly essay that we're going to include. This is written by Shireen Sherrard Johnson, who is the chair of English at Pomona College. She begins her proposal talking about the first episode of the HBO series Lovecraft Country, in which the protagonist flees a burning, collapsing house led to safety by his enslaved ancestors' ghost. Such cinematic forays into the Black fantastic through a revision of the Lovecraft universe are also indebted to the Afro-futuristic world building of writers like Octavia Butler, whose fiction reveals the sci-fi minefields in American literary landscapes. Shireen Sherrod Johnson's essay focuses on Gloria Naylor's Linden Hills, a 1986 novel, which is a parable that satirizes Black bourgeois desire and uplift strategies, modeled after Edgar Allan Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher and Dante Alighieri's Inferno. Reading Naylor's novel as an intertextual response to Poe's sinister aesthetic and Gothicism anticipates innovations in late 20th century Black women's speculative fiction and horror. Poe's Gothic interiors and narrative perspectives provide a template for how Naylor's chapters work as cautionary tales about the obsessive and accumulative qualities of American individualism. After a comparative analysis of The Fall of the House of Usher and Naylor's depiction of the home that is at the center of the Dante-esque planned community of Linden Hills, Shireen touches on other examples of the African-American Gothic tradition by writers such as Pauline Elizabeth Hopkins and Ann Petrie. Now I want to talk about, Tish already told you about one of the pieces that we're going to have from the creative writers. I'd like to talk about the others. As Tish alluded to, we have 2 interviews. In October, we conducted an interview with Linda D. Addison, a horror, science fiction, and fantasy poet, short story writer, and novelist. She's a 5-time winner of the Bram Stoker Award, recipient of the Horror Writers of America's Lifetime Achievement Award, and she was also named Grand Master for Fantastic Poetry by the Science Fiction Poetry Association. So we had a terrific conversation with her in October, and that interview will be part of the post-study special feature. In addition, Linda has also written an original poem for us. It's entitled On My Own. And it is a response. In fact, it is a call and response, as she refers to it, to Edgar Allan Poe's poem Alone. And it's one of several Poe poems or Poe call and response poems that Linda has written. So, and she talks about that in the interview. So it's going to be great to have not only this original poem, but to have Linda also in the interview talk about that poem and the other Poe poems that she's written. A second interview that we're going to have is with Maurice Carlos Ruffin. He's a novelist and a short story writer. His 2019 novel, We Cast a Shadow, which amongst many other things is a kind of updating of Invisible Man, has won, has gotten all sorts of acclaim. And he had a new short story collection came out last year, which is getting similar rave reviews. The final piece, so we've got the 4 scholarly essays, we've got 5 pieces from creative writers. The final one is a personal essay by Valerie Wilson Wesley, who is a novelist. She has 2 series, the Tamara Hale series, which is a hard-boiled mystery series. Tamara Hale is a hard-boiled private eye based in Newark, New Jersey, and East Orange, New Jersey. And she has a new series of novels. The second one has just come out, the Odessa Jones series, and these are cozies. In addition, Valerie has written children's novel and children's stories, and has written mainstream novels as well. So that is an overview of this entire project. But that's just telling you what's going to happen. We're actually now going to have 2 of the writers themselves who will give us teasers about what you're actually going to find in that special feature. So Frankie, if you could start us off, please, I'd greatly appreciate it.
Hello, everyone. First, I want to thank John and Tish for inviting me to take part in this project and this journal issue. I should say that up front that this is, I have this personal involvement with Poe in the sense that I was a Virginian. I am still a Virginian at heart, grew up in the South. And so, can you all hear me okay? I'm sitting back a bit. And so, my first exposure to Poe was as a horror writer, and he is the reason I will not be buried. I'm going to be cremated. This whole idea of being buried alive, which I discovered later once I became a criminologist, was not an unreal fear. So, I had that. And I also observed on the board of MWA, Mystery Writers of America, and as the executive vice president. And so we give away the Edgars. And so I'm coming at it from that point of view, and also as a mystery writer. So for this particular panel, I'm going to be looking at hauntings and Gothic horror in Poe and in the works of African-American crime writers. And what I say about it is that the works of Edgar Allan Poe are important to this literary tradition. I'm going to, in this article, be examining Poe's narratives of his subjects and protagonists, traumatized white males. I'm going to be contrasting what he does with those males in terms of masculinity and to some extent femininity in his works, and contrasting that with a select group of African-American writers, crime writers from the early 20th century up to the present. And I'm going to be looking at some of Poe's stories. My first nonfiction book was about Black characters in crime and detective fiction. So I'm going to start with Poe's Goldbug and look at some of the short stories, and particularly The Murders in the Rue Morgue. And I'm going to be contrasting that with this depiction of space and place and the writers' color and how they look at this whole issue that he's dealing with at some level in terms of how he depicts slavery and Blackness and what they do with that same contrasting trope in terms of their stories. For example, in the mystery, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, he's dealing with the concept of the murders of these two white women. At the same time in the 1840s and after, when you're looking at African-American writers and their engagement with this in the context of slavery. As a criminologist, I'm looking at what we call the missing pretty white woman syndrome, the murder of pretty white women, the value of the white victim. And we're also looking at that in the context of the writings that began in the late 19th century, looking at this idea of the African-American as an example of that, how should I put this? So I'm giving you a short version. Lombroso, writing about this, talks about this idea of the African as being at the hierarchy, in terms of the hierarchy of offenders, and talking about this in terms of murder and this type of offender, and talking about it very much in a way that Poe presents the orangutan in his story, set in Paris in the urban setting of this period. So I'm looking at it in terms of race and masculinity and the white female victim. And the idea of when Black writers, crime writers, and other writers are writing about this, they're looking at this in terms of the white offender and the Black victim. And so it's the value of the white victim that we're talking about in criminal justice and criminology. Also, very much like the orangutan in terms of the hierarchy that we're looking at, because when we're looking at Lombroso, he's talking about the orangutan as the primitive that the African-American offender is very much like when we look at this with the long arms and the dark face, the Black face. And when you look at the illustrations of that short story, for Poe's short story from the 40s, 50s, and later when we're looking at what Lombroso is talking about in the 60s and 70s, you're getting that kind of discussion. So I'm going to be looking a bit at colonialism and the idea here in Poe's short story of the sailor who brings this wild beast into the civilized setting where he kills these two white women and stuffs one of them down the chimney. And you're going to find that reflected in writings like Wright's Native Son, where you have his protagonist who kills and then stuffs his victim down into a furnace and tries to destroy the body in the same way that you have the orangutan stuffing the victim down the chimney. I'm going to be looking at that. The Conjure Man Dies, John Archer's Nose, set in Harlem in the 1930s, 40s. I'm going to be looking at briefly Blanche on the Lamb with Barbara Neely. And I'm going to be looking at Gone Fishing, Walter Mosley, where he has a Black man in Texas dealing with this idea of voodoo. Cutting Season, Attica Locke, which is actually set on a plantation where we have the protagonist is an African-American woman. And there is this idea of the plantation community where there's a haunted cabin, and she is, every time she goes into this plantation area where the cabins are still there and where tourists to the plantation are going in to see the cabins, she has the sense of something evil, of something haunted about this. And so I'm going to be looking at this in various ways, coming at it from the standpoint of a mystery writer, and from the standpoint of someone who looks at Poe and has this engagement with him, but also in terms of how mystery writers, looking at this in terms of whiteness and darkness and the haunting of space and place, would be looking at this. And I'll say a bit more about it later on if you're interested. I don't want to take too much time here. John, back to you.
Thank you, Frankie. Let's turn it over to Michelle now. Frankie just mentioned Blanche on the Lamb, and I know that Barbara Neely is a focus of your essay. So please take it away.
Thanks so much to Norlisha, to you, John, to you, Amy. It's just such a pleasure to be in front of all of the scholars that I've learned a lot from, and amazing to be near you, Frankie. But my essay, as John mentioned, has as its focus a kind of comparison of bringing the works together of Barbara Neely and of Poe. And if you're not familiar with Neely's work, I'll give you just a little touch of that. She's crafted one of the first Black women's sleuths, the popular fiction, a domestic worker whose name is Blanche White, who finds herself on the run from the law due to a minor offense, but ends up hiding in plain sight as a substitute housekeeper and cook for a wealthy, shady, ultimately homicidal family of white, wealthy, can say Southern aristocrats in Farley, North Carolina. And I incidentally live in North Carolina right now, which is one of my interests in these works. So Blanche on the Lamb is the first of a series of 4 books, and in each of these books, the sleuth Blanche White investigates the criminalities of the rich and the kind of upper class people, both Black and white, in the North and in the South. But the 2 books that bookend the series, Blanche on the Lamb and Blanche Passes Go, are the ones I focus on. And in this last one, Blanche White returns to her hometown of Farley, North Carolina, and enters into the world of its wealthy elite, again as a caterer. And at this second occasion, comes into contact with a wealthy man who many years ago raped her in his house, and also becomes involved in investigating the murder of a young working class woman. So the big question for me was always why Poe and Neely, and I began with this intuitive sense that there were intertextual resonances and I thought, well, could it merely be a coincidence that the key to one of her first mysteries lies in differentiating between the dirty white sausage curls of one older white woman and the little orphan Annie Afro of her biracial imposter? Thinking, of course, to Rue Morgue and differentiating between the hair of a woman and the hair, the tawny strands of the ape's hair. Or that in another book, or in that same book, actually, there's a body that's concealed in a makeshift crypt. And ultimately, I came to the conclusion that these were indeed mere coincidences. So I won't go into this any further, but I think, you know, like the perception of literary echoes and intertextuality, they're often in the subconscious of the reader. But looking further into Barbara Neely, I really found that there was a kind of resonance, but more like a discordant echo, something that's attuned to the insights of Poe's work. And I'll tell you like a couple of the issues I investigate. I do think that he's not a very natural literary ancestor, except for, you know, the idea that most detective fictions are vaguely related to Poe. I was thinking kind of as, you know, a relative once, twice, 5 times removed in some senses. But in my essay, I really talk about how we might think intertextually about them, thinking through, say, Toni Morrison, The Africanist Presence, Jay Watson in Faulkner Studies, who talks about luring whiteness out of hiding. And I come to a place where I think about Barbara Neely's works as kind of feeling their way into a mirror side of Poe, being tied to him, but also doing something that pulls away from his insights and makes them her own, with a Black feminist detective perspective. So a couple of the things I discuss in my essay, of course, I compare the genius of Dupin to the genius of Blanche White, and the way that their imaginative identification and preternatural leaps are sourced. And also the ways that night is important to them, like the sable divinity and Blackness for Dupin takes a very different shape in the person of Blanche White, and the framing of their intellectual faculties in different communities and spaces. And I contrast the impulse to detect, one as a pastime, another as a necessity. Another subject I discuss is the Poe's existing and recognized appreciation of the discerning gaze of Black domestics. And, you know, we see this in the minor characters like Pompey, in The Man That Was Used Up, and in Jupiter and the Gold Bug. And I discuss how Neely's depiction of this discerning gaze draws a more powerful connection to the way it's paired with the intimate terror of domestic spaces, particularly in the American South, where white men treated Black women as sexual prey and made lynching the price of looking for Black men. I also talk about the Gothic landscapes a little, which comes up in a number of other essays here, but focusing on how, if, you know, aristocratic houses can crumble in Poe's stories like Usher and Metzengerstein, Neely's version of the Gothic shows how resilient whiteness is, even in these Gothic landscapes, even when murderers are identified. And finally, in the company of a number of scholars, including Beth Sweeney here, I look at the Gothic as a site that invites detection and detective figures, and talk a little bit about the way that Neely's depiction of detection and domestic inquiry invite us to turn our attention back to the presence of servants in Poe and their looks. So in Metzengerstein and Usher and so on. So thank you very much for allowing me to share a little bit of my project with you.
Well, thank you so much, Michelle. At this point, I think we're ready to throw it open to the audience for comments and questions. I just like to briefly explain that you know, a lot of where we are right now is as a result of Toni Morrison's Playing in the Dark. Morrison very much very much got a kind of channel of focus on Poe and race. And kind of an initial response to that was to look at how Poe himself depicted slavery, depicted Black characters. This whole project is the other side of the coin. It's African-American writers looking back to Poe. Many of these writers were very much inspired by Poe when they were younger and even late into their lives. So you know, this project owes a huge debt to Toni Morrison, but I think it's in Morrison's spirit. It's taking that much. We hope that it's taking this whole subject into new directions that it hasn't been to before.
Okay. I'm just posting in the chat. I've opened the chat box up, and then I just put a reminder of the session information, since we did get those teasers, and I have a feeling we may want more information about your papers. So hopefully everyone can see those posts in the chat. And then those of you who are on here, I'm saying you can either use the raise hand icon and speak your questions or comments, or just type your questions or comments into the chat box.
I'd like to also say that John is right in making sure it's understood that to some degree, this project is grounded in looking at responses to Morrison's Playing in the Dark. It was published in '93, but I can remember I was in graduate school at that point, and it influenced how not only did I teach Poe, but it influenced how I thought about 19th century American literature as it influenced the 2000s when I began to teach. I began to teach in 2001, and that idea of the Africanist presence in American literature is still alive and well, even though there's been responses to Morrison, of course. And I remember in graduate school, there were lots of conversations among graduate students and our professors who were doing African-American literature. It really did open a door on thinking about the invisibility yet absolutely visible presence of Africanist stereotypes and ways of shaping whiteness, the contrast of whiteness to Blackness. And so that's part of the curiosity that drove me to get involved with reading new scholarship that's returning to those ideas. And definitely Isaiah Lavender's work is doing that. But again, Gary Phillips says he's responding to that as well, and his reimagining of the characters that he's going to bring into his fictional piece, where he recreates the characters as Black characters, but following the line of logic of the plots from Poe.
Jeffrey, please.
So this is a question, this comes up occasionally. On the Poe Society website, I of course have all of Poe's writings in their historical versions, all the ones printed during Poe's lifetime, and various of the major scholarly collections. Anyway, Poe uses the N-word in several instances. And every now and again, I get a letter from someone asking me to pull that word, or at least put asterisks or something like that. So far, I have declined to do that. It sort of bothers me to censor a historical work, even though it's clearly, obviously, an offensive word to modern eyes. Clearly, you're all scholars actively working in the field, and you're obviously working with historical subjects. I'm sort of curious what your insights might be on this problem that occasionally does pop up. That's an open question, if anybody.
Well, yeah, I have multiple points multiple approaches to this because I teach a graduate course on race and crime. I have to decide when I'm going to use that word in class. Because I also do research on crime history, I use it in context when it's appropriate to use it. And I explain to the students in the class, because I also teach historical research. If we're doing historical research, we would keep it intact in whatever we're doing. So I use it when appropriate there. As a mystery writer, I struggle with it because I'm writing a book right now set in 1939 and trying to decide whether or not I'm going to use it, and if I use it, in what context. So, I also teach popular culture, and it's used in rap music and other contexts. And so I have to decide there who can use this word. I mean, when is it appropriate? So I really struggle with it a lot.
Anyone else want to chime in on this topic?
I'll just add, like Frankie, I teach in popular culture and I'm teaching a class on stand-up comedy right now. So obviously it's unavoidable, but I do think the onus is upon, in an instructional setting, the onus is upon the professor to introduce a sense of the gravity of the language and the shifting uses of it in the 19th century. I'm not an eradicationist, as I guess Randall Kennedy would put it, but it seems very difficult to imagine a Poe, maybe it seems precious, a Poe without Poe's language, which was used very deliberately and carefully. So it seems difficult to accede to any demand to remove language from the book rather than to interrogate it.
I'm not teaching now, but when I was teaching, I also created some early courses around 2001, 2003 that had to do with hip hop culture. And needless to say, with gangster hip hop culture and the lyrics coming into our discussion, there was no avoiding using the N-word or other words that were also offensive related to gender and race. That intersectionality. But the point is, I always gave the context because I too thought then and now that you shouldn't erase, you should give context. And the other thing is, of course, the earlier use, the 19th century use, is alive and well in the 21st century for people who use it in exactly the same context as it was originally to debase, et cetera, et cetera. So the balance of the two is what I see as necessary for continuing to put into context and explain.
And if I could add, when we look at Poe, he's not alone. Agatha Christie in 1939. I was also looking at her. I mean, the original title of the book that is now known, and then there was none. First, it was the 10 Little N-words, and then you get the 10 Little Indians, and then there are none in the 1960s. So, he's not alone. And, as Tish said, well into the 20th century, we're dealing with that. In fact, in the Congressional Congress, in the Congressional Record, you have congressmen standing up and talking about, the N in the woodpile. Hence the title of my nonfiction book about that.
You all have the advantage that you're presenting this material in an educational setting, so you can give it that context, whereas I'm posting essentially raw historical material without necessarily giving it any commentary, although I'm hoping it is used for classroom settings a good deal. So interesting to hear. It's a complex issue in lots of ways. But I'm not hearing anybody in favor of censoring it just arbitrarily, which I think I agree. I'm disinclined to just take it out because a couple people want it to go away. It's what Poe said.
Question for Frankie. Frankie, if you were publishing your book today, would you use the same title?
The title was, I used the actual title of her book in my original title. The publisher at the time, Greenwood, said, we cannot use this title because you'll offend people. And so our compromise was Out of the Woodpile, because Agatha Christie in the book has two characters who say the in the woodpile. And so we use that title, but that's the compromise title. If I could get away with it, I would use it, but then your publishers are reluctant to do that.
John, I don't know who's doing questions. It's Alexander. I just wanted to just do a general question. I think it's a lovely project. And just wondered about the people who were involved in it and the perspective back on what their sense since Toni Morrison of poet critics and scholars actually dealing with issues of race. And I guess particularly, I wouldn't mind a sort of perspective on that notion of kind of average racism that's used in sorry, my memory is really having trouble today. You almost all know that book. And in Jerry Kennedy's
Poe and the Masses.
Thank you. And Jerry Kennedy's collection on race in Poe, which is, I've forgotten the date, but it's something like late 90s. Anyhow, that's my general question.
Yeah, I think that was about 10 years after Morrison's Playing in the Dark. It was Romancing the Shadow, the collection that Jerry Kennedy and Lillian Weisberg put together. I don't think I can summarize, everything that has happened since then. But I do think that Isaiah Lavender, I mean, you can tell from the first part of what Tish read, stop apologizing for Poe. And I know from reading his proposal, he says you can't let Poe hide under this cover of average racism. Poe was what he was, according to Isaiah. He believes we have to recognize that, but he also says he wrote this fantastically evocative novel, which then Matt Johnson has responded to, creating this, this space for us to talk about all of these wonderful issues. Tim, I think I saw your hand first.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it. This comment kind of follows along with quite a bit of what's been talked about. This summer, I'm planning on teaching a version of our Development of the American Novel class that simply starts with Playing in the Dark. And I'm going to have my students read through the Poe essay, or the Poe section of that essay. I've forgotten which of the three it is, but I'm going to read Narrative A. Gordon Pym, but then we're going to read two other novels that Morrison does not comment on. And I don't know exactly which one I want to add to it, but definitely I'm going to do E.D.E.N. Southworth's novel called The Hidden Hand. Michelle is nodding. Okay. Because the Africanist presence is not repressed in a way. It's everywhere. And it's a racist novel to the last degree. I mean, the N-word is there and everything, but we have Capitola Black and Black Donald and Gabrielle Lenoir and all the other Lenoirs. And then the Black woman is named Granny Gruel. And she actually is a very important character who has all the information that people need at the very beginning and starts this whole plot going. It's fascinating how central that character is, and yet how reduced in size she is. But I was wondering if people were already thinking in these lines. I haven't come up with sort of my own view about how Blackness works in E.D.N. Southworth and whether or not it's so loud that it's repressed. What I think is very interesting, I'm leaning a little bit toward our next program, is the way in which, if those of you know the novel, Capitola Black's power is you predict, partly based in her whiteness, right? And of course, Capitola Black being the woman that is constantly fleeing everyone makes her sort of a kind of consonant with other Black figures in the real background of the book. So Black Donald, of course, is the villain here, and he's got some of those characteristics of Poe's Ranitan, etc. Has anybody pursued this? Should I know before I go in that other people have these a reading perhaps in line with Morrison?
Yeah, I wrote about it. I wrote about that novel in my 2019 book, Edgar Allan Poe and his 19th century American counterparts. What's in the publication history of it is fascinating because it was a serial novel, and it was serialized 3 times before it was finally published in book form, which meant that people responded to it in different times, so in different ways. So you've got Harriet Jacobs, in a sense, responding to it before the Civil War. You have Pauline Hopkins responding to it early in the 20th century. There was a mention of Terence Whalen's notion of average racism. Southworth was an abolitionist. She wrote in abolitionist newspapers, and yet her depiction of African characters and the dialogue, couldn't be any more racist than it is. So it really, kind of illustrates what Whalen is talking about there. People North and South, white people North and South, may have disagreed about slavery, but they were pretty much in agreement in their opinion of Black characters. And of course, the minstrel stage, completely fed that.
Thank you, John. I'm not up to 2019 yet, so I'll get to your book, absolutely.
John, I think I saw your hand next. John Martin.
Okay, I was actually about to type my question into the chat because I'm going to have to leave campus. They're closing our campus due to a weather hazard, so I'm going to have to hop off. But I think I can maybe quickly summarize it, and then if the discussion goes on beyond that, then I can listen to the recording later. In any case, I was really interested in this whole issue of the influence of Poe and other writers like Lovecraft on contemporary Black writers and artists. I feel like there's been a lot of discussion in comic circles, which is kind of the area that I'm interested in lately, among Black creators like Victor LaValle and John Jennings and Damian Duffy, who have all worked in the genres of horror and science fiction, and to a lesser or greater extent have had to wrestle with these legacies, right? That are part of the the foundations of those genres, and dealing with these explicitly racist forebears. But I'd love to hear more from any of you, but particularly those of you who have done your own creative writing, about how directly or extensively you feel contemporary Black writers can or should or have to wrestle with this influence on their work. I know some writers have done it very openly, explicitly. Others, I think, have addressed it more subtly. Victor LaValle actually, rewrote one of Lovecraft's stories in a really fascinating way. Others, I think, have simply tried to sort of deal with it in more symbolic ways. But I'm just curious, sort of from any of you, how much of that work still has to be done by contemporary writers and artists who have inherited that.
Well, I'm aware of what I have inherited as a fiction writer, but I don't write directly to that. I look at intersections. So I'm looking at the intersections of race, ethnicity, class, sexuality, and rather than only at race. And so but my character, my Lizzie Stewart character is, when I first started writing, I was writing this series because I wanted to use true crime, real life crimes as my inspiration. And I was inspired by the death of a Black man killed by a mob when I was found this when I was looking at Danville in the early 20th century. And so I was approaching that horror of lynching with this kind of haunting and blackness, whiteness thing, a race, as I was looking at that in the dissertation. And then later on, when I look at it in my fiction. So my character, Lizzie Stewart, is actually at this point, she's a crime historian, and she's the head of an institute on the study of Southern crime and culture. And so she's actually talking about this in the first person as she looks at these issues historically. So I managed to slip that in, looking at the back of the past and the present as I'm writing, and as she's talking about this. And that's how I deal with it, by having her to talk about it as she's going about her research and presenting what she's finding to the audience of these readers.
Beth, I see you have your hand up.
Hi, I have sort of a comment, but this is just a great panel. It is so exciting. My mind is going 1,000 miles a minute as I try to sort of respond to things people are saying in my mind. Just now, I was thinking in terms of what Frankie said about well, Victor Laval's Big Red Machine, which I think is the last thing I've read by him, or the first thing maybe that I've read by him. But he does the same sort of thing. He has a protagonist who's doing research, and so, and kind of like sharing the research, even if it's sort of fantastical research. But otherwise, I had a quick comment, I guess, each for Michelle and Shireen. Well, I guess for Michelle, this is not a question, sort of like an anecdote. Barbara Neely came to my detective fiction class to give a guest lecture maybe 20 years ago. And she just had this amazing presence. My students were completely blown away. And it was also very interesting because she said at the very beginning, we were reading Blanche Passes Go. And she said, despite what your professor has told you, this is not a detective novel. And since it was a detective novel class, I was really sort of taken aback. But she was sort of a great presence, especially with my students who were a little bit naive and sort of didn't really quite know how to respond to her energy, or even just sort of like dealing with a writer. But as far as I know, the whole Blanche White series is out of print. And I don't know if that's true or not, but so I just wanted to sort of see if that is true. I think the last time I taught that course, I had to give all of my students a little separate assignment that they were going to find used copies of one of the novels to read because they weren't in print. And then for Shireen, I'm so excited to hear about your paper because I often teach Linden Hills, but I've never thought of it in terms of the fall of the House of Usher. I usually think of it in terms of the Bluebeard story. But in a way, that's sort of like where a lot of these kind of Gothic narratives of women being killed and so forth originates. So I guess I don't really have a question, unless I have a question for Michelle about whether Barbara Neely's series is in print. But this is a great panel.
It's not difficult to find copies at the moment. It has gone through multiple editions, though, as you probably noted. So it must have been out, and then they bring it back in, and then they'll do another series. And it's like every time the image on the cover is absolutely different, and so it's pretty interesting to follow how they draw or how they visualize a Black domestic worker, especially if they place her in relation to a building or a house in the South. Oh, great, Tim just spot one. So yeah, so I guess there are lots of used copies available. And I'm so excited to hear that you met Barbara Neely. I've been reading a number of interviews with her, and she's always, she never speaks much about detective fiction, but is always speaking about Toni Morrison. So there's some fascinating inspirations there from her.
Susan, the Barbara Neely series is being reissued. I think all of the books are out. A new publishing company brought them out.
Michelle, would you hold up your copy? I'm curious to see what the cover is.
This is an older copy, but you can see how
Oh,
they,
yeah.
presented Blanche. But there are other ones that have like a black silhouette that they use. There's another one that's just very hyper colored, like a bright green. Yeah, all sorts of stuff.
Thanks.
Well, I'm so disappointed that Valerie Wilson Wesley's When Death Comes Stealing is no longer in print, because that, I just think that's such a terrific book, because it's this, you know, it's a tough Black female urban private eye, but she's a mother. And the whole plot turns on motherhood, and it's really fantastic. But I mean, and that's a great question. How do we get things back in print? And if we can't, what are the alternatives to make copies available to students or just to anybody who might want to have access to them?
Well, you know, I use e-reserves a lot to put things on copies of things. The downside of that is I can only do one copy of because of the rules for interlibrary loan and the rules for what we can have because of copyright issues. But you know, some things I just put on in e-reserves.
Leslie, I see your hand.
Thank you. I think Jacqueline had her hand up first. But I had just wanted to ask, and I want to thank everybody for being here. And this is such a fabulous panel. It's so interesting, and yeah. So thank you. And I just had a question. You know, I was thinking about Poe Studies Association as an author society, and the kind of institutionalization of you know, what it means to have an author society and to think about Poe and Poe's role in American literary history. And I was just wondering, you know, now that we're in the 21st century and we're, you know, reflecting on Poe, if the panelists were interested in commenting on, you know, their thoughts about, you know, Poe's role in American literary history now, you know, now that we're rethinking, reflecting, you know, just, you know, any reflections on where you think Poe stands and how we should approach his work now that we are thinking about it in new ways.
Well, you know, I actually, because I also teach an undergraduate class on violence in American literature, so I find that my students, these are undergraduate criminal justice students, often would minor or another major in sociology or psychology or some other field, but they tend to know Poe's horror fiction, and they know the poetry, particularly The Raven. But they are not familiar with the detective fiction. And so often I have to, you know, tell them that he also wrote detective fiction and explain that, and they don't know his biography that well. So we watch a biography of Poe before I talk about that. And then I try to talk about him in the context of the 19th century, when I'm also talking about the appearance of the penny press and first police departments, and placing him both as a nonfiction writer, editor, journalist, and a fiction writer and a poet in that context, and bringing it forward and looking at his influence on other writers, not just Poe, but the descendants of Poe and the people who responded to him in one way or another, and bring it into the present. But they are not as familiar as one would expect. But then these are criminal justice majors, so if I were talking to English majors, it might very well be different.
I must admit too that connecting with that, a lot of students who are interested in Afrofuturism, as well as authors like Isaiah and what Gary is going to be doing, they connect with Gothic fiction and Poe's influence on that genre. So it's alive and well often because they find out about Poe, or they get more deeply into Poe because of that connection. It's a very arguable connection that's very current in 21st century. So I think that's one connection that can be made as well for the current ways that Poe might be looked at, even as he's interrogated differently.
Jacqueline, my apologies. The hand is almost the same color as your background, so I missed it.
I'm sorry. No, and no problem, because it gave me a little bit time to try to organize my thoughts a little bit, because I have a lot of them. And I think this is such a great project and very needed project. And I was particularly interested because I have a tiny background in criminology as well. So it was a pleasure hearing Frankie talking about the white female victim. And one of the projects I have now in the background, because I need to finish my thesis first, is actually looking into much more recent phenomena as true crime channels on YouTube, for instance, that are bringing that white female victim from literature to channels. And we have various questions regarding the so-called Black digital humanities, which is also part of my field of study, where when we have a Black victim, those videos are not being shared or promoted by YouTube algorithms. So we are looking into that, and we don't have as many views as when we have the classic, more Black and dark associated with the sources of horror and crime, and then whiteness related to the victim or the solution for those problems. And since I'm also interested in Poe's horror, I was thinking if that would reflect in other aspects as well, not only characters, but this idea of this darkness reflected with sources of horror and terror, and then we have the whiteness regarding the victims and the narrators especially, and even the solutions for those problems. And I was even thinking about the first version of Berenice's that I was able to see through Jeffrey's website, where we have, for instance, her hair changing from golden to black when she's transforming or being ill. So I guess it's more a comment, and my thoughts are all over the place. So I apologize for that, but I think it's very interesting, and I would like to see if, or I wonder if in this volume we will also have this this consideration about Poe's horror and the relation between Blackness and whiteness in Poe's horror. I hope I made myself understandable. Thank you.
Well, Jacqueline, I'm really interested in what you're doing, because I do talk in my essay about the what we talk about in the 21st century in criminal justice as the missing pretty white woman syndrome. And I think you're getting at that a bit. But yeah, I was just thinking of the Mary Rogers case, that influences Poe, where in the Penny Press description, the editor talks about this white female who's found floating in the Hudson, the real Mary Rogers. And then when the autopsy, when they're talking about the blackening of her body, or she's dead, and then Poe's, this whole fascination he seems to have with dead white women. And then you have the editor of this real life newspaper talking about this pretty white woman dead, and describing her in terms of the blackening of the body. So yeah, there's really interesting stuff you're doing there.
Thank you.
Other questions or comments that people might have?
I would just like to thank you all again. I think this has been tremendous. I always look forward to my issue of post studies, but now I'm looking even more forward to the issue that's coming in 2023. So that's great. And also to attend your panel. So thank you so much for this amazing, I think a long time coming session for us here in the Post Studies Association. For John for putting it together, for Imran for being part of the press that's going to publish the special issue, to Norlisha, Frankie, Michelle, everybody who's contributing. Just thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
I realize I said it like that's the final word, but maybe this is a good place to stop today. But if anyone else, has any other questions or comments.
I'm just glad we are keeping up the discussion in Boston. So I'm looking forward, so I don't have to wait until 2023 for the issue to come out.
For sure, for sure. All right, well, thank you all so much. And we have recorded the presentation, and I will send I'll send the recording link out, and we'll make sure that all of our presenters have access to it. And I'm going to go ahead and stop our recording now, and please let's thank our presenters.